I'm very excited to be joined today by actor, writer, and director Antonia Bogdanovich. We will be speaking about her 2014 film, Phantom Halo, which is being released as a director's cut titled Sleep No More 2022. Welcome, Antonia.
Great. Thank you.
All right, thank you for coming. Can you tell me what inspired you to revisit and create a director's cut, Sleep No More, nearly a decade after the original release of Phantom Halo?
Well, there was some issues with the distribution at the time. It didn't really get a proper distribution. And so I felt really disappointed and quite frankly, like a failure as a filmmaker because, I make films for people to watch and enjoy. I make films for my audience. And of course, as a form of expression, but of course, movies are meant to be watched. And so that was part of the impetus. My father passing away in January 2022 also was just made me think, okay, of course I'm carrying on his legacy by being a filmmaker, but it kind of became all encompassing important for me, like to carry the torch. Before he'd passed away, I hadn't really thought of it. It's like father, daughter, just making movies. We love to do the same thing. And so that was part of it. And he never liked the original title. He would always say, great picture, terrible title. So he always thought, my parents didn't mince words. They were both filmmakers. So,
Right.
so anyways, I thought, and he always thought it should be called Sleep No More. So that was part of it. And also I didn't like a few scenes that I wanted out of the original and just a tighter ending. So that's really was a combination of things. And some of the producers I was working with saying that, we should really get this out there. Current producers that I was working with really liked the
Right.
film.
Well, I watched it today. It's great.
Oh,
Really
thank you.
enjoyed it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I guess that really ties into the second question. How does Sleep No More is different than Phantom Halo? And you said you tightened it up a little bit. Is there no major structural changes to it?
No, there's no major structural changes. There's some scenes that are now cut that I didn't think worked. And the ending has a few missing sequences, like at the very end.
Right.
I would say they're sequences because it's all kind of coming together for the finale. So you can feel that it's ending. There's shots and there was some voiceover that I just cut the whole sequence. So it's not really that different. Again, this was more about bringing it back out really, especially in 2019. We didn't have the access online or video on demand or anything like we have now. I mean, if you even go back 5 years before, 2 or 3 years before even 2015, I mean, things were changing so quickly. I mean, it's not that long ago that Netflix had its first series, and we were like renting it on. Anybody who's a grown up remembers that. Of course, my son probably doesn't. He's 17, but we now have really a lot more options for low budget independent films, of which this was. It wasn't like a big, so that's that was more the impetus than anything else, trying to get it back.
You say it wasn't that big, but it's just jam packed with talent, though. All the actors and
well, yeah, that's very important to me. But what I mean is the budget was low. It wasn't big in studio. It was made really independently. I raised money myself, and the budget was like under $1 million. Today, I think it'd be impossible for that on what we were able to do.
And the actors really, I don't think they got paid that much. I don't remember. Everybody was very fair. Everybody knew what we were doing.
Okay. Well, can you tell me about the process of creating the director's cut? What challenges did you face in that?
Or the challenges of director's cut?
Yeah, actually making it. Having to decide what you drop and what there's no way to really add, I guess.
Oh, there wasn't many challenges, sir, putting out the director's cut. I would say it wasn't a long process. We were able to do it fairly inexpensively because I had some real great young guys that are just tech savvy. I wouldn't say there were any challenges. There's always a challenge to distribution. But my producing partners actually had started the distribution arm of their company. So we just decided to do it with them. So I wouldn't say there were a lot of challenges to getting it distributed, because we did it
Okay.
in the company I was working with.
Okay, I think you already told me the most significant change that you made, which is you took a whole scene out. I noticed that if you look at the cast list from Phantom Halo, there's a lot more people in the cast list. Um, Miss
Oh, it's
Parks.
the same cast. We didn't cut anybody's. We might have
Oh,
cut. Well, there might have been. Yeah, I don't think we cut anybody's part out completely, but it's the same cast list. It was. It
oh,
was.
they don't match up on IMDb. Yeah, I guess they haven't filled it all in yet.
Oh, okay. No, no. There's no casting changes. I'll check
Okay.
with that.
This is going really fast. I had 10 questions. I cut it down to 5. I didn't want to go over time. I loved you when you wrote this, how the combining the Shakespeare or the counterposing the Shakespeare with the comic, something the Phantom Halo comic, sometimes considered low art as to high art, and I thought that was really well done. Do you have any comments on your inspiration for that or anything?
Oh, absolutely. My father considered television when I was growing up low art. It, of course, has changed since. I mean, there's probably a lot of arguments for and against this, but for my family, it was about the time that The Sopranos came out. The television
Uh,
became a whole different, especially for my father and my mom. My parents just didn't watch TV, and so there was no TV in my father's house. So that was the comic book. That's the exact parallel to the comic book. And then for Shakespeare, it was film, golden age of film, and of course, some of the great films from the 70s, at least for my father. I mean, of course, there are some great films from the 80s and 90s, but really, I was brought up with a very the classics were it. And so that was kind of like Shakespeare's it. You can kind of get away with anything else morally as long as you're performing and studying and living in that creative space of high art. So that's a tall order for a young girl like me,
uh,
growing up in, a different age completely. I was a child of the 80s. Um, I considered some films in the 80s some of the greatest films ever made. So that, my dad and I had ongoing arguments about that. I listened to hip hop from a very young age before it was popular. My father used to tell me that wasn't music, and we'd have these massive fights. Um, it is the most popular music today,
right.
So, you know, so that's definitely where I drew all my inspiration. The other thing is the criminality, the thieves. I had some friends that were thieves, and they used to rob houses. So and it came back on me when they robbed my house. So it's a lot
Oh,
of turning what was when I was a child or a teenager, a real heartbreak and the loss of trust of my best friends to like, okay, this is how we can figure out or kind of move past it, right? Thieves are very interesting people. The reasons why they steal are not always for money. Although my friends, they didn't steal to put food on their plate and pay rent. But so, just looking into the reasons why people, steal in the first place.
yeah, I thought that was real interesting in the movie. It seemed like all 3 of the Emersons had a different method for getting out of their problem.
Right.
Dad was going to get drunk and gamble his way back, and um, Samuel was going to. Well, he didn't know what Samuel was doing, but Beckett
Right.
was trying to criminal his way through, and so you don't see that until the very end, And I was like, oh wow, he had a plan, and he was working his plan the whole time too.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. All of them were coming from different places depending on how they were treated by their parents. I mean, I think my sister and I are very different. We were treated differently by our parents. And so that was something else I explored is, the differences in the point of view for siblings, depending on, you know, Samuel was never forced to steal from their mother. So that was kind of Beckett's core wound was that, he needed to please his dad and he felt like they needed money. So he stole from his own mother.
Right.
you know,
Okay.
which
Well,
I've seen a lot of people do in life. Usually it's drug related, but I didn't want to make this drug related, right? That's not what this is about. Of course, it is about alcoholism, but or not really. I mean, I try not to emphasize that too much, but obviously he has a drinking problem.
right. It was just part of his character,
Right.
and it wasn't.
Right.
It didn't dominate. I guess. What kind of you said you had these movies? Some of the movies you thought in the '80s were some of the greatest movies made. Can you tell me a few of them if you can come up with it? Because I'm
Oh, well,
really interested in that.
Blade Runner. I own the director's cut. Um, that's hard if I'm going to think of those off the top of my head. I mean, look,
Yeah.
I wouldn't call John Hughes just was really influential to me
Hmm.
because I grew up watching his movies. It's easier for me to pick out movies in the 70s, like
Oh, okay.
The Godfather Part 1 and 2. I grew up watching those movies with my mother, whereas at my father's house, I watched Lubitsch, John Ford, and Howard Hawks, and
I see.
Orson Welles, a lot of John Ford. And if you're watching those movies when you're really young, a lot of them don't really stick. They're very complex. Even John Ford's movies are pretty complex. So I also really liked Apocalypse Now. I like The Deer Hunter. I always liked really dark films. I gravitated towards those films. I don't think my father ever talked about some of those films, although he didn't dislike them. They just weren't his focus. His focus was classic film.
Okay.
Of course, I loved the comedies in the 80s. Eddie Murphy was like my favorite. I grew up with and also, to a certain extent, Richard Pryor. He was friends with my dad.
Oh,
But, you know, his stand-up comedy was like genius. But I didn't get to see him live. I was too young. And even if I would have gone, it would have been totally inappropriate to go see him when I was so young. So the comedies were just great. I mean, I can rewatch any of those comedies. And I don't really gravitate towards comedies as much anymore. I mean, The Hangover is my favorite, probably my favorite comedy of all time. Doesn't matter how many times I watch it. It's
that
hysterical.
movie is absolutely hilarious.
Completely hilarious. But then you can watch a lot of movies. And then, of course, the rise of Tom Cruise. I mean, he's of my generation. Thelma and Louise, that's one that comes to mind as one of the greatest films. It was written by a woman, directed by, I think it was Ridley Scott, right? I think.
I'm not sure off the top of my head.
I think I'd have to look that up. I think it's Ridley Scott. And then, of course, a lesser known movie but this is 90s now, would be True Romance.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't know who Quentin Tarantino was when I went to see the movie, but I made note of it in my head because I knew the writing was not necessarily Tony Scott. I know Tony Scott directed the movie. So those are kind of those movies that really influenced me. I would say some people say that I was influenced by Quentin Tarantino. I really don't think about it when I'm writing a movie. Okay, these are my influences. But of course, every movie I see, I learn and am affected by. But I'm not trying to mimic or imitate when I'm doing a film. But I was obviously very influenced by Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah, he's great.
There's a resonation, but I didn't think of that at all until somebody said it after I did the movie. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, sure. Everybody, you know, the ending's quite violent, but I feel like the story warranted that, you know. So yeah.
So are you a big fan of the neo noirs from the 60s and 70s? Get Carter and stuff like that. I guess they're maybe a little earlier. Because
I haven't seen any of those movies, to be honest. The movies that I grew up with that were noir would be The Big Sleep.
The classic.
And of course, LA Confidential, but that's a newer movie. But I would say the only noir movie that comes to mind that I saw quite a bit was Big Sleep. I didn't grow up watching noir. I grew up watching Hitchcock, and I grew up watching Orson Welles. And John Ford. And Howard Hawks was my favorite director when I was a young girl. That was the one. Oh, and of course, yeah, there's also Frank Capra. So I mean, I literally saw those movies over and over and over, but not noir films. I didn't know I was writing a noir film until the director of photography told me this was a noir film. I'm like, okay. I don't really think in terms of genre. That was one of the things that I think people were critical of, was that I kind of mixed up the genres. I wasn't really thinking about that. It was like with the Elix comic book, he's trying to escape through a comic book. But he's also has to be a Shakespearean actor. I didn't think those are two genres. To me, it's like, this is what he loves, and he's also a Shakespearean actor. And then, of course, the crime part. But I think, people do care about genre, and they make that very. So I have thought about that a lot. Like, I'm more specific in, I can't do 5 or 6 genres. Sometimes people are very critical of that. And, we read a couple of negative reviews, and we can learn from that. We don't have to say, my movie was terrible, it's the worst thing, because a lot of artists do take those reviews very heavily. I've talked to a few directors about it, very famous directors who have been really thrown by reviews. But yeah, I didn't really think that this was a noir movie until somebody else told me it was noir. I don't think in terms of, I'm not that academic. I didn't study film in film school. My parents showed me movies and then talked about how to make them, and we didn't really talk about genre. It was like, okay, this is a horror movie. I didn't watch a lot of horror movies, although I really did like, The Shining. I really did. But that's like a brilliant horror movie. Mm-hmm. But anyways, yeah, I digress.
Okay, that's fantastic. That was that was the 5th question I had about the neo-noir and the influences, and you answered all of that.
Oh, okay.
Let's go. What would you say? I mean, what have I not asked you that you think is important to be asked and to get out?
No, I mean, I think, look, I think I've been thinking a lot about how hard it is to be a female filmmaker and how hard it is to get movies made. And even for somebody like me, who people might assume, the general public, the general population, that I have it easy and I'm what I would call a Nepo baby. I mean, I hate that expression, of course, because I am a nepotism baby. I did get my first job at 18 as a production assistant because my mother was a production designer on the film. But let's be honest, if I didn't do the job, I would have gotten fired. They wouldn't have cared. If I didn't do the job well, if I didn't show up every day, if I didn't work 15, 20 hours a day like everybody else, actually, I always felt like I had to work harder because I was a reflection of my parents. I wasn't like a stranger. I had to work much harder. And my parents never said you have to work harder because of X, Y, and Z. They just said you have to work hard, period. My mother always used to show me like all the resumes she'd get on her desk because she was an executive at Sony at a production company when I was in my 20s. And she's like, you better work your ass off because there's a pile of resumes on my desk of people who will take your job. Now, I wasn't working directly for her, but what she meant was somebody's going to take your job if you're not doing your job well. It's so competitive, I think. So, I didn't get my financing from somebody that knew theater. I didn't get my financing from somebody that knew polyplat. Yes, they have confidence that I know how to do it because I grew up in it. But so I think for any young woman who's trying to be a filmmaker, I would just give them the same advice that my parents gave, because there's so many times I wanted to give up. It's so hard. And it can be soul sucking, is just don't give up. It's something my mother said to me 3 weeks before she died in 2011. And I thought it was going to be really easy for me to get movies made and make my films. And it's been the exact opposite. It really is tough. And you have to just keep going. You just got to keep writing. You got to keep making phone calls. You got to keep pounding that pavement and just keep doing what you love to do. So I think that's what I'd like to pass on to other women, because I can also say for men that are starting out in this industry as film directors, don't give up either. But I have to speak specifically to women because I do feel like less movies are made every year by women, and I don't make female-centric film. I would surely do if a screenplay warranted that, but I am just as capable of doing any kind of film, no matter what focus it's on. I'm glad the trend is going towards more female protagonists. That's great, but we're just as capable of doing this job as any other person, whether that be male, female, trans, non-binary, all inclusive is what
Okay. I'm really surprised that, now you think that eventually this would be going away. And it's shocking to hear you say that in a way. I'm far away. I'm in Florida, far away from Hollywood and everything out there. But it just, how long can this go on? Where basically people are being discriminated against.
It's still like a couple years ago, I read a statistic that only 5% of films every year are directed by women. I don't know who's deciding that. I'm not in those positions.
Right. Or just an institutional thing that's continued on. And I noticed that when I started doing the film reviews, the terrible ways that actresses were just burned up and used up. And I never really noticed growing up and watching movies, because I watched the same ones that you were talking about, that they're mostly men's stories with a few women thrown in here. And I've become very conscious of it the more I review.
Right.
And it's kind of sad.
Well, I do think that is definitely changing, that there is, especially over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been so many more movies about it. Thank God.
I thought I saw at the end of the movie, the car turned around. Was he going back to rescue not Mrs. Lee, Miss Ross? Looked like the car stopped and turned around. Or am I making things up?
Oh, no. You mean the last shot at the very
last shot?
No. Miss Rose does get away, and that's actually the part that I cut out where she's in a taxi cab. But no, they go their separate ways. But she does get out alive. She does get out alive. She goes into the counterfeiting room and takes some money out. And I cut that whole sequence out because I felt like it wasn't staying. I was trying to focus on the two boys.
Right. Which was really powerful, that like it looked like No Way Out, and then it didn't end like I thought it was going to end. I was very surprised when it ended differently.
Oh, really? How did you think it was going to end?
Badly, very poorly.
Exactly.
I didn't think anybody was going to leave the house.
Oh, no, I wouldn't do that to an audience. I don't like those kinds of endings. I've always been one that if an ending is really like life or more like life, I want to see it. I am still wanting to live in a fantasy, right? And fiction. I mean, yes, there's movies based on real life, and of course I would tell the authentic story, but if it's a fictional story, I want some kind of feeling at the end that's not so depressing. Otherwise, I don't. That's just me. I like to feel some. I like to feel good at the end of the movie, even if some people have passed away that we're sad about. That's really important to me.
I was just watching. I was reading and watching about Killer's Kiss, which was Stanley Kubrick's second independent and last independent film, and the studio made him put a happy ending on it.
Oh.
So the next movie was The Killing, excuse me, and no happy ending for anybody in that one. So yeah, I thought that was very interesting, though, the way you ended it.
Well, yeah, and each filmmaker has a different reason for making an ending like that, and I think that's super personal. For me, I want people to at least come away with some. It doesn't have to be like ecstatic and laughing and happy, especially if I'm doing a comedy, because I'm drawn to drama. But some kind of redemption or some kind of feeling of closure, or the characters should grow. I mean, of course, there's a lot of movies that I love that don't have happy endings. I mean, but the ones that I really love have great endings that aren't even Quentin's endings. I love Quentin's endings. They're not. I mean, they're brutal, but they're not like you love his ending. So I think it's not just necessarily, it doesn't just mean a happy ending, but an ending that is cathartic in some way where you're not feeling like cheated.
Mm-hmm. So it completes the whole arc. Well, I want to thank you very much for spending time with me today. Everybody,
my son was in the room, like crawling underneath the thing because I'm in his room. And like, I'd have to be on a big sound stage and for him to like say something before the cut to be able to yell at him. You're not working, Mom. You're just, anyways, this is life. This is life in the independent world.
Yes. I had to make arrangements to have dogs put in rooms and
I know. That's what I tried. So pardon me, the audience. This is life happening here.
Understood.
I'm usually in my living room, but there's people out there. So it is what it is.
Okay. Well, again, thank you very much. I'm sure everybody on the show is really going to enjoy this. I appreciate your time. I love the film, and I'm going to put this out and see if I can get some more attention to it.
Oh, thank you, John. I so appreciate talking with you, and I loved your questions, and it was a pleasure. It was really a pleasure.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, of course. No problem.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
This film has a great cast, including Sebastian Roach, Rebecca Romaine, Luke Kleintank, and Thomas Brody Sangster. So put this great neo-noir thriller in your film watching queue right away.